In the glittering heart of Banana Island, Lagos, where gates opened only for the powerful and chandeliers glowed over polished marble floors, Ifeoma Nwosu moved like a shadow no one cared to notice. At 19, she had already learned the kind of silence poverty teaches. The silence that swallowed hunger. The silence that buried tears. The silence that nodded, "Yes, Ma," even when your feet ached, your stomach growled, and your dignity was hanging by a thread. Every morning before sunrise, Ifeoma rose from the small servants' quarters behind the Afolayan mansion. She tied her wrapper tightly, washed quickly with cold water, and stepped into another day of labor before the family upstairs even opened their eyes. She swept endless floors, dusted imported furniture, ironed clothes she could never dream of wearing, and carried trays of food she herself could not afford to taste. To Mrs. Kene Afolayan, the lady of the mansion, Ifeoma was not a girl with dreams. She was simply the maid. To Chief Afolayan, she was part of the house arrangement, no more personal than the driver or the gardener. To visiting guests, she barely existed at all. But Ifeoma did exist, deeply, quietly, fiercely. At night, when the work was done, and the mansion grew still, she would sit on the narrow edge of her bed and open an old exercise book, where she wrote down new English words, nursing terms she copied from newspapers, and prayers she was too afraid to say aloud. She had once told herself that suffering was temporary, that one day she would wear crisp hospital whites and walk with purpose through bright corridors, helping people who had been forgotten by the world. It was a fragile dream, but it was hers. What Ifeoma did not know was that somewhere in that same house lived another soul imprisoned by a different kind of wealth. Kene Afolayan, the only son of the house, had the kind of life many people envied. At 23, he had already been positioned as the heir to the Afolayan Empire. His future had been arranged in polished meetings, elite dinners, and firm handshakes between men who spoke more of legacy than love. He wore expensive watches, drove imported cars, and smiled in photographs that made him look fortunate. But fortune is not the same as freedom. Kene had spent most of his life being told what to become, which school to attend, which circles to move in, which kind of woman was suitable, which emotions were weakness, which mistakes would disgrace the family name. Inside the mansion, he was treated like royalty. Inside himself, he often felt like property. The first time he truly noticed Ifeoma was on a rainy evening in July. A storm had rolled over Lagos without warning. The sky darkened early, and the house staff rushed to close windows before the wind drove rain into the halls. Ifeoma was hurrying across the upstairs corridor with folded laundry when one of the windows near the study burst inward from the force of the storm. Startled, she stumbled, and the neatly folded clothes spilled onto the polished floor. Before panic could fully rise in her chest, a voice behind her said quietly, "Leave that. You'll hurt yourself trying to do everything at once." She turned sharply. There stood Kene. Not in the stiff public version of himself seen at family events, but in a simple white shirt with the sleeves slightly rolled, his expression calm, almost human in a way she had never expected. Rain-laced light spilled through the cracked window behind him, softening the sharpness of his face. Ifeoma immediately bent down. "I'm sorry, sir. I'll clean it now." But Ken crouched before she could gather the scattered clothes, picking up a shirt from the floor himself. She froze. In that house, men like him were not supposed to touch disorder. Women like her were supposed to disappear before help was ever needed. Their hands brushed as they reached for the same piece of fabric. For one strange second, the storm outside seemed quieter than the one that moved through her chest. "Don't be afraid," Keen said gently. Ifeoma lowered her eyes, not because she was weak, but because poor girls learned early that looking too long at powerful people could be mistaken for ambition. Still, something shifted that evening. Not love, not yet. Just recognition. For the first time in a very long while, someone had looked at Ifeoma Nwosu and seen a person. And for the first time in a very long while, Kene Afolayan had spoken without the weight of his family's expectations pressing against his throat. Neither of them knew it then, but that small moment in the storm would one day tear open lives, build others, and leave 3 children standing in the middle of a truth no amount of wealth could bury. Because some tragedies do not begin with cruelty. They begin with kindness in the wrong house. After that evening of rain and scattered laundry, Ifeoma Nwosu told herself to be careful. Kindness in a house like the Afolayans was never simple. It could be misunderstood. It could be punished. It could awaken hopes that had no right to exist. So she did what poor girls with fragile dreams always did. She returned to work, lowered her eyes, and tried to pretend that the sound of Kene Afolayan's voice had not followed her into sleep. But the mansion was large, and fate had a quiet way of arranging repeated meetings. A few days later, Ifeoma was sent to place fresh flowers in the upstairs family lounge before guests arrived for one of Mrs. Kene Afolayan's charity planning meetings. She worked quickly, carefully trimming stems and adjusting crystal vases with hands trained not to leave a single thing out of place. She did not hear Kene enter until he spoke. "You always choose the white lilies." She turned, startled again. Ken stood by the doorway, jacket slung over one shoulder, loosened tie at his neck, looking less like the polished heir to a conglomerate, and more like a man tired of performing excellence. Ifeoma swallowed. "Madam likes them, sir." He glanced at the flowers, then back at her. "No, my mother likes orchids. These are your choice." Ifeoma hesitated. It was dangerous to admit any personal preference in that house, as if having taste itself was an act of rebellion. But there was something in Kene's tone, not mocking, not commanding, that made dishonesty feel unnecessary. "They look peaceful," she said at last. Kene's face softened in a way that unsettled her more than anger would have. "Peaceful," he repeated, as though it were a word he had not allowed himself to consider in years. From that day, their conversations began in fragments. A question near the kitchen passage, a brief exchange by the staircase, a moment under the back veranda when the evening heat softened and the compound lights flickered on one by one. He asked her what she read in the little notebook she always kept tucked away. She was embarrassed, but when she finally admitted she wrote down nursing terms and copied articles from old newspapers, he did not laugh. Instead, he said, "So that's your dream." Ifeoma nodded cautiously. "To become a nurse?" "Yes, sir." He leaned against the wall, studying her, not with the entitlement she had grown used to from wealthy men, but with something quieter, something that made her feel visible in a way she did not know how to defend against. "Then don't stop because this house is loud," he told her. "Noise is not destiny." That sentence stayed with her. For the first time, someone had spoken to the future inside her rather than the poverty around her. Yet even in those moments, danger hovered. The house had rules no one needed to write down. Staff were staff. Family were family. The gap between them was not merely money. It was hierarchy, image, bloodline, and power. A smile held too long could become gossip. A conversation at the wrong hour could become accusation. In households ruled by control, innocence rarely survived suspicion. Ifeoma knew this. And yet she found herself noticing things she should not have allowed herself to notice. The exhaustion behind Kene's expensive clothes. The way he went silent whenever his mother entered a room. The tightness in his jaw during family dinners. The loneliness that sat behind his polished manners like a secret wound. She had thought rich people lived without fear, But Ken moved through the mansion like a man living under invisible inspection. One evening, she was arranging files in the study when raised voices drifted from the adjoining sitting room. She froze. Mrs. Afolayan was speaking in the clipped, dangerous calm that always meant someone was being cut apart without a knife. "You are not a child anymore, Kene. Enough of these delays. Vanessa Cole's family has been more than patient. This engagement benefits everyone." Keene's answer was low, controlled, but unmistakably strained. "Mother," I said, "I'm not ready. Readiness is for ordinary people. Legacy does not wait for mood." Ifeoma's hands trembled slightly over the files. Vanessa Cole. She had heard the name before, usually accompanied by admiration for guests. Senator's daughter. Beautiful, educated abroad, elegant, suitable. Everything a family like the Afolayans valued. Everything a girl like Ifeoma could never be allowed to compete with. That night, in her small room, she sat on her narrow bed and repeated to herself what she had always known. This could go nowhere. Whatever softness had begun to grow in stolen conversations was foolishness. Ken belonged to a world that did not merely exclude girls like her, it erased them. Still, hearts do not always obey the logic that protects them. A week later, Kene found her in the back compound just after dusk. The cooks had finished for the night, and the air smelled faintly of rain-soaked earth and diesel from the generators humming beyond the fence. Ifeoma was seated on a low stool, reading from her notebook under the dim yellow security light. "What are you memorizing now?" he asked. She looked up, startled, and showed him the page reluctantly. "Basic patient observation." He smiled. "You're serious?" "I have to be." He sat on the low concrete edge opposite her, not minding that there was no luxury in the moment. "What happens when you become a nurse?" She frowned. When, he corrected. The certainty in his voice pressed unexpectedly against her heart. She looked away. "Then I help people. Then maybe my life means something more than surviving." For a moment, he said nothing. Then, more quietly than before, "Your life already means something." The words landed too deeply. Ifeoma's throat tightened. No one had ever said something like that to her without wanting something in return. She should have stood up. She should have walked away. She should have remembered that houses like this often punished girls for the audacity of being seen. But instead she remained where she was, and for the first time, silence between them did not feel like distance. It felt like closeness waiting for a name. Far above them, through the lit windows of the mansion, unseen eyes and older ambitions still ruled the house. And somewhere in that same house, the future Mrs. Afolayan wanted for her son was already being prepared. But down in the compound, beneath a weak security light and a Lagos sky heavy with clouds, something dangerous was beginning, something that did not yet look like rebellion, but already carried the power to ruin every carefully arranged plan. Because love rarely announces itself with thunder. Sometimes it begins as the simple, reckless comfort of being understood. After that evening in the compound, Ifeoma Nwosu began measuring her life in two parts. The hours when she was simply enduring the Afolayan mansion, and the stolen moments when Kene Afolayan spoke to her as though she were more than labor wrapped in a uniform. Nothing dramatic changed at first. That was what made it dangerous. There were no reckless declarations, no careless touching in open hallways, no foolish attempts to challenge the hard rules of the house. Instead, what grew between them was quieter and, perhaps for that reason, stronger. Kene began leaving things for her without making a show of it. A second-hand nursing textbook placed near the back veranda where only she would find it. A newspaper folded to an article about scholarship opportunities. A new pen slipped into the pages of her notebook after he saw her struggling with one that barely wrote. Each gesture was small enough to deny, but too thoughtful to misunderstand. The first time Ifeoma found the textbook, her hands trembled as she opened the cover. There was no note, only a line lightly marked on the first page. "Start where you are." She read those words over and over that night by the weak bulb in her room, as if they might become a doorway out of the life she was trapped inside. Kene, for his part, found himself seeking the parts of the day that brought him near her. In a house built on performance, Ifeoma's presence felt honest. She did not flatter him. She did not speak to him like a future chairman or political asset. She listened carefully, answered simply, and carried a strength that did not beg to be noticed. One Sunday afternoon, while the rest of the household prepared for guests, the generator briefly failed, plunging part of the mansion into silence. Ifeoma had been sent to the library to dust shelves before the power returned. She was standing on a small stool, reaching for the upper edge of a bookcase, when the stool shifted beneath her. Before she could fall, a hand steadied her waist. Her breath caught. "Ken." The contact lasted only a second before he stepped back. But the air between them changed completely. Ifeoma climbed down too quickly, nearly dropping the dust cloth in her hand. "Sorry," he said, though his voice had grown unsteady, too. "It's fine, sir." He looked at her for a long moment. "You don't have to call me that when we're alone." The words unsettled her more than the touch had. In that house, names carried boundaries. To drop "sir" was not a small thing. It was an invitation into dangerous equality. "I should go," she said softly. But Kene's voice stopped her. "Ifeoma." It was the first time he had said her name like it mattered. She turned. "You are allowed to want more than this place," he said. "Do you know that?" She looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time saw not just the heir to wealth, but a man aching beneath expectations he did not choose. "And are you?" she asked. The question struck deeper than either of them expected. Kene gave a faint, bitter smile. "I'm still learning." From then on, their conversations deepened. They spoke of things neither of them could say to anyone else. Ifeoma told him about her late mother, about learning early that hunger could teach discipline, but also fear. Kene told her about boarding schools, business dinners, and the suffocating way privilege could become another kind of prison. She learned that he hated pretense. He learned that she feared hope more than hardship because hope could humiliate you when it failed. Without naming it, they became each other's refuge. But refuge inside enemy territory is never safe. One evening, Mrs. Afolayan passed through the upstairs corridor and paused when she heard low voices from the partly open study door. Inside, Kene was seated at the desk while Ifeoma stood across from him holding a sheet of paper he had been helping her understand. A nursing entrance form she barely believed she had a chance of completing. Mrs. Afolayan did not enter. She simply stood there for a moment, saying nothing, her polished face unreadable. Then she walked away. That silence was worse than anger, because women like Kene Afolayan did not react before they understood where to strike. Later that night, Ifeoma lay awake with unease pressing against her chest. She did not know why exactly, only that the mansion felt different, as if the walls themselves had begun listening. And in another wing of the house, Mrs. Afolayan sat in her private lounge, holding a glass of wine untouched in one hand, thinking not like a mother, but like a gatekeeper. She had built her family's world too carefully to let a servant girl disturb its design. What had begun as kindness was no longer invisible. It was becoming attachment. And attachment, in a house ruled by class and control, was the first step toward war. From the moment Mrs. Kene Afolayan heard those low voices in the study, the atmosphere in the mansion changed. Nothing open, nothing obvious, That was not her way. But Ifeoma felt it immediately. Orders became sharper. Her movements were watched more closely. A senior housekeeper who had once ignored her now corrected her over the smallest things. How she folded napkins, how long she took in the pantry, how often she passed through the upstairs corridor. Twice in 1 week, Mrs. Afolayan asked where she had been at specific hours, though the answers were already written in the household duty schedule. It was not discipline. It was surveillance. And because poor people are trained to sense danger before it is spoken, Ifeoma understood the warning long before anyone voiced it. She began avoiding the spaces where Kene might find her. She took longer routes through the service passage. She kept her eyes lowered when he entered a room. When he tried to speak to her near the rear staircase one afternoon, she stepped back so quickly it startled him. "Did I do something?" he asked quietly. She shook her head. "No, sir." The old title had returned like a wall. Kene studied her face. "Then why are you running from me?" Ifeoma looked toward the corridor before answering, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because this house is not blind." He followed her glance and understood. For a moment, frustration flashed across his face, not at her, but at the invisible machinery that ruled every human feeling in that home. "You've done nothing wrong." But Ifeoma gave him a sad look. The kind only people who have lived at the mercy of others know how to give. That has never protected anybody. He had no answer to that. That evening, Ken sat through dinner with his parents and heard every polished sound in the room as if from a distance. The quiet clink of cutlery, the servants' measured footsteps, his father's updates about an acquisition in Port Harcourt, his mother's remarks about an upcoming private dinner with Senator Cole's family. Then came the line he had been dreading. "Vanessa will be joining us on Sunday," Mrs. Afolayan said, lifting her wine glass with calm precision. "It is time people stopped asking unnecessary questions about your future." Kene set down his fork. "My future is not a public project." Chief Afolayan barely looked up. "Everything attached to this family is a public project." Mrs. Afolayan's tone remained soft, but it carried steel. "Vanessa is cultured, educated, presentable, and from a family that strengthens ours. She knows how to stand beside a man of importance. That is not something one experiments with." The words were aimed at him, but Kene heard the deeper meaning beneath them. "There are women fit to be seen, and women fit only to serve." His jaw tightened. "And what if I want to decide my own life?" His mother's gaze lifted slowly to his face. "Then learn to want wisely." Across the room, Ifeoma stood by the sideboard with a water jug in her hand, invisible as always, and yet every word entered her like a wound. That night, she sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the servants' quarters, staring at her nursing notebook without seeing it. She had tried so hard not to name what was growing in her chest. She had told herself Kene's attention was simple kindness, that his gentleness was a passing human softness in a cruel house. But the truth had begun to burn beyond denial. She cared for him, not because he was rich, not because he had noticed her, but because in a world built on humiliation, he had spoken to her soul as though it belonged to her, and that made him dangerous. Elsewhere in the mansion, Kene paced his room long after midnight. He was angry at his mother, at the future being arranged around him, at the obedience that had shaped him for years into a man who knew how to endure but not how to fight. Most of all, he was angry that Ifeoma now looked at him with fear when he had only wanted to be a place of safety for her. The next afternoon, fate gave them a moment neither had planned. Mrs. Afolayan and Chief Afolayan had gone out for a meeting. Several staff had been sent on errands. Rain threatened again over Lagos, and the sky hung low and heavy. Ifeoma was in the laundry room sorting freshly pressed clothes when Kene appeared at the door. This time she did not pretend surprise. She only looked tired. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "I know. They're already watching." "I know." He stepped inside anyway. For a moment neither spoke. Outside, thunder rolled faintly in the distance. Then Kene said, more honestly than he had ever spoken in that house, "I don't know how to stop thinking about you." Ifeoma closed her eyes briefly as if the words hurt. "Please don't say that." "Why? Because it isn't true?" She looked at him then, and the pain in her face made his chest tighten. "Because it is." Silence filled the small room. The kind of silence that comes when two people finally stand inside the truth they have both been avoiding. Kene took a careful step closer, giving her time to move away. She didn't. "Ifeoma," he said, his voice lower now, stripped of polish and inheritance and fear. "When I'm with you, I feel like myself, not their son, not their plan. Me." Tears gathered in her eyes, though she fought them. "People like me don't survive being loved by men like you." The words broke something open in him. "Then maybe the world we're in is the problem," he said. She gave a soft, disbelieving shake of the head. "And what will you do? Change your whole family? Change Lagos? Change the kind of people who decide who matters?" Kene could not answer with certainty. Not yet. But for the first time he reached not for comfort but for courage. He lifted one hand slowly, giving her every chance to refuse, and touched her cheek with a tenderness so careful it felt almost reverent. Ifeoma's breath caught. The rain began. It fell first in soft taps against the louvers, then harder, until the whole house seemed wrapped in water and thunder. And in that hidden room between steam-pressed clothes and the smell of starch, two people separated by class, fear and power stood trembling at the edge of a life that had no permission to exist. Then Ifeoma whispered the most dangerous thing she had said yet. "What if this destroys us?" Kene's eyes held hers. "Then let it at least be something real." And when he kissed her, it was not reckless the way forbidden things are often imagined. It was slow, uncertain, aching. The kind of kiss that feels less like sin and more like two lonely people finally arriving where their hearts had long been waiting. Outside, the storm deepened over Lagos. Inside the mansion, love crossed a line that power would never forgive. After the kiss in the laundry room, nothing in the Afolayan mansion felt ordinary again. The walls were the same. The marble floors still shone. Orders still came sharp and cold from Mrs. Kene Afolayan. Meals were still served on time. Cars still rolled through the gates with tinted windows and quiet power. But beneath that polished routine, something had shifted beyond repair. For Ifeoma Nwosu, every hour became both precious and frightening. She had given herself to a feeling she had spent months trying to bury, and now there was no easy way to return to the safe numbness she had known before. She moved through her duties with outward discipline, but inside her, a quiet fire had started burning, warming her, yes, but also threatening to consume everything around her. For Kene Afolayan, the change was even more dangerous. He had spent most of his life obeying invisible boundaries. But loving Ifeoma, even in secret, awakened something rebellion-like in him. For the first time, he began imagining a future that had not been designed by his parents, a future where he could choose love over arrangement, truth over convenience, and a woman's worth over her class. That kind of imagination was powerful. And in houses ruled by control, imagination itself can become an act of defiance. Their relationship deepened in stolen fragments. A few minutes in the back compound after the staff had withdrawn for the night, a quiet conversation in the study while the family attended a fundraiser. a folded note tucked inside Ifeoma's nursing book. A touch of hands in passing that lasted half a second too long. Ken began helping her more openly, though still in secret. He brought her forms for a nursing entrance program and explained parts she did not understand. He encouraged her to sit for the qualifying exams. He even offered, carefully, to pay. But that was the one thing Ifeoma refused. "No," she said one evening beneath the veranda, her voice soft but firm. "You can encourage me. You can advise me. But don't rescue me." Ken looked at her with quiet admiration. "Why does that sound like pride?" "Because it is," she replied. "It's all some of us have." He smiled faintly. "Then keep it." It was in moments like that that he loved her most, not with grand speeches, but with the growing certainty that she was stronger than almost everyone in his world. Yet for all the tenderness between them, fear never left. Ifeoma knew exactly what would happen if they were discovered. Wealthy families rarely blame their sons for crossing lines. They blamed the women who made those lines visible. If scandal came, Kane would be called confused, emotional, temporarily distracted. She would be called ambitious, shameless, manipulative. The punishment would not fall equally. That truth sat like a stone in her chest. One Saturday evening, the family hosted a private dinner for elite guests from politics and business. Among them was Vanessa Cole, elegant, poised, expensive in every visible way. She entered the house like someone who already knew it might one day belong partly to her. Her laughter floated too easily through the halls. She touched Kane's arm with practiced familiarity. Mrs. Afolayan watched them together with thin satisfaction. From the service area, Ifeoma saw everything. She saw Vanessa's silk dress catching the light. She saw the approving glances from guests. She saw Ken's polite expression, the one that revealed nothing. And she felt, with painful clarity, the shape of the world she was not meant to touch. Later that night, after the last plates had been cleared and the guests had gone, Ken found her outside near the generator house. She was standing with her arms folded tightly, staring into the dark compound. "You've been avoiding me all evening," he said. She gave a small, bitter smile. "You had company. Vanessa means nothing to me." Ifeoma looked at him then, and there was no anger in her face, only exhaustion. "That may be true for your heart, Kene. But in this world, people like Vanessa don't need your heart to win. They only need your surname." The words cut because they were true. Ken stepped closer. "I can end it." "Can you?" she asked gently. "Or do you only want to believe you can?" He fell silent. That silence said more than any promise could have. Ifeoma turned away, blinking hard. She was not accusing him. She was educating him. There is a difference between wanting freedom and being willing to pay for it. She had spent her whole life paying for survival. Kene had not yet learned the full price of choosing truth. Still, love kept drawing them back. Weeks passed. The rainy season softened. The city moved from storm-heavy evenings into humid, uneasy calm. And then one morning, while scrubbing a bathroom sink in the guest wing, Ifeoma stopped suddenly, her hand gripping the edge of the counter. A wave of dizziness hit her. She stayed still until it passed, then continued working. But the next day, the nausea came again. And the next. At first she blamed exhaustion. Long hours, poor sleep, stress, fear. But when her monthly cycle failed to come, a different kind of cold moved through her body. No. She counted the dates in her head again and again, willing them to rearrange themselves. No. That evening, after everyone had slept, she sat alone on her bed in the servants' quarters, with her hands pressed against her mouth, trying not to cry too loudly. By morning, denial had become terror. She found a small chemist 2 streets away on an errand and bought a test with money she had been saving for exam registration. She took it in secret, in a cramped staff bathroom while the house above her prepared for breakfast. When the result appeared, Ifeoma stared at it for what felt like a lifetime. Pregnant. Her knees weakened beneath her. For several minutes, she could not breathe properly. The room seemed too small, the light too harsh, the future too suddenly enormous. She thought of Mrs. Afolayan's eyes, Vanessa's polished smile, Chief Afolayan's cold pride, Kane's unfinished courage, her own fragile dream of becoming a nurse. And then, against all panic, another feeling rose quietly through the fear. Life. A child. A living consequence of the only love she had ever truly known. By the time she told Kene, and the sun had already gone down. They met in the back compound near the same low wall where they had once spoken about her dream. The night air was warm and thick. Somewhere beyond the fence, Lagos traffic murmured like distant warning. Kene knew something was wrong the moment he saw her face. What happened? Ifeoma looked at him for a long moment, as though crossing a bridge she could never uncross. Then she said the words that would divide both their lives into before and after. I'm pregnant. Everything around them seemed to stop. Kane stared at her, not with disgust, not with anger, but with stunned, silent realization. For one suspended second, the world held its breath, and in that breath, destiny changed shape, because love had now become evidence. And evidence in a family like the Afolayan was the beginning of destruction. For a long moment after Ifeoma Nwosu said the words, Kene Afolayan could do nothing but stare at her. I'm pregnant. The sentence seemed to hang between them, heavy with fear, wonder, and consequences, too large to measure in one night. Rainwater still clung to the leaves near the compound wall. Somewhere beyond the gates, Lagos traffic moved on as if nothing had happened. But inside that quiet corner of the Afolayan estate, a future had just arrived, uninvited. Kane stepped closer, his voice lower now, stripped of every polished layer. Are you sure? Ifeoma nodded once. Yes. He ran a hand over his face, not because he regretted her, but because reality had come faster than courage. His chest tightened with the collision of two truths. He loved her, and the world he came from would never allow this peacefully. Then he looked back at her, and what she saw in his eyes first was not fear. It was tenderness. We'll figure it out, he said. But Ifeoma had lived too long inside the mathematics of power to be soothed by hopeful words alone. How? She asked quietly. With what plan? With what protection? Kene opened his mouth and closed it. That small hesitation chilled her more than any insult could have. Still, he took her hands in his and said, I won't abandon you. It was the right sentence. It was also the easiest one to say before sunrise. The next few days became a fragile blur of secrecy and tension. Ifeoma moved through the mansion carefully, hiding morning sickness, swallowing fear, counting every glance from Mrs. Kene Afolayan as a possible threat. Her body had already begun changing her relationship to the house. Even before anyone knew, she no longer felt like mere staff. She felt exposed, as if her skin now held a truth too large to conceal forever. Ken, meanwhile, became restless. He missed meetings, snapped at an assistant, spent too long pacing his room at night. He told himself he was thinking of solutions, but underneath that was a harder truth he did not want to face. Solutions were easy to imagine in private and costly to defend in public. He considered telling his parents, then imagined his mother's face. He considered taking Ifeoma away quietly, then realized how little he had truly prepared to live outside the machinery of his family. He considered confrontation, then felt the old training of obedience rise in his throat like a hand. For the first time, he saw himself with painful clarity. Love had found him, but courage had not yet matured inside him. A week later, the secret broke. It happened in the worst possible way. Not through confession, but through suspicion sharpened by class prejudice. That morning, Ifeoma was serving tea in Mrs. Afolayan's private sitting room when a sudden wave of nausea hit so violently she nearly dropped the tray. She managed to set it down, but the strain showed on her face. Mrs. Afolayan's eyes narrowed. "What is wrong with you?" "Nothing, Ma," Ifeoma said quickly. "Nothing does not make servants look like they're about to faint on imported carpet." "I'm sorry, Ma. I think it's just stress." Mrs. Afolayan said nothing for a moment. Then in that smooth, dangerous tone that meant she had already started connecting things, she asked, "Stress from what, exactly?" Ifeoma lowered her gaze. "I'm fine, Ma." But she was no longer invisible. Not to a woman who built her power on detecting threats before they were named. By evening, Mrs. Afolayan had instructed the senior housekeeper to keep an eye on Ifeoma. By the following day, she had noticed enough: skipped meals, hidden nausea, trembling hands, to arrive at the possibility she hated most. Scandal had entered her home wearing an apron. She confronted Ifeoma 3 nights later. The house was quieter than usual. Chief Afolayan was away at a late political dinner. Kene had not yet returned from Victoria Island. The staff had mostly withdrawn. Ifeoma had just finished cleaning the upstairs guest corridor when Mrs. Afolayan's voice stopped her cold. "You, come into my sitting room." The door closed behind them with a soft click that felt like judgment. Mrs. Afolayan did not offer her a seat. She remained standing near the window in a silk wrapper, elegant and composed, as though cruelty required good posture. "How far along are you?" Ifeoma's blood ran cold. "Ma?" "Do not insult me by pretending not to understand. I asked you a question." The room seemed to tilt. Ifeoma's first instinct was to deny. But denial before women like Kene Afolayan often only prolonged suffering. Her hands tightened at her sides. Mrs. Afolayan turned fully to face her. Who was responsible? Silence. Then another question, sharper this time. "Is it one of the drivers? A steward? Some useless boy from outside?" Ifeoma's heart pounded so hard it hurt. She could feel the child inside her future, vulnerable and dependent, and something in her refused to let fear be the only thing guiding her. So she said nothing. That was enough. Mrs. Afolayan stepped closer, studying her with cold disbelief as a more terrible truth took shape. "No," she said slowly. "No. Don't tell me." The horror in her face was not moral, it was social. By the time Kene entered the mansion later that night, the storm had already begun. He found Ifeoma standing in the middle of the main downstairs hall, pale and trembling, while Mrs. Afolayan's voice cut through the house like broken glass. "You shameless girl! In my own home!" The staff stood frozen at a distance, pretending not to watch. Kene's pulse slammed against his ribs. "Mother!" She swung toward him. "So it is true." Silence fell. This was the moment. The moment that divides men from boys. The moment promises become backbone. The moment love must either stand up or expose itself as weakness dressed in soft words. Ifeoma looked at Kene with terror, yes, but also with a desperate last hope. Not for romance, not for rescue. For truth. All he had to do was step forward and say it. All he had to do was choose her in the light. But Chief Afolayan had just walked in. 2 household staff were staring. His mother's face carried both fury and warning, and years of training. Obey, preserve, do not disgrace the family, rose inside him with terrible force. Kene opened his mouth. Nothing came. That silence lasted only a few seconds. But for Ifeoma, it was long enough to destroy a life. Mrs. Afolayan saw it instantly, saw his fear, saw his failure. And because power moves quickly when truth hesitates, she took control of the room. "You will leave this house tonight," she told Ifeoma, voice icy with triumph. "Whatever is inside your womb, you will not use it to trap this family." Ifeoma looked at Kene one last time, not pleading now, just looking, as if she were memorizing the face of the man who had loved her in secret and lost her in public. Then she bent slowly, picked up the small bag that had been thrown near the staircase, and held herself upright with the last scraps of dignity she had left. No one touched her. No one defended her. No one stopped the humiliation. By the time she stepped out through the service gate into the Lagos night, carrying a child and a shattered future, she understood something every wounded woman eventually learns. Love without courage can be more devastating than hatred. And behind her, inside the glowing mansion, Kene Afolayan stood in the ruins of his own cowardice, already regretting the silence that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The night Ifeoma Nwosu was thrown out of the Afolayan mansion, Lagos did not pause for her pain. Cars still moved. Generators still hummed behind high gates. Streetlights still flickered over potholes and rain-dark roads. The world remained indifferent, as it often does when a poor woman's life is breaking. She stood outside the service gate with one small bag, trembling hands, and a future growing silently inside her. For several minutes she could not move, not because she did not know where to go, but because humiliation has weight. It sits on the chest, numbs the legs, and makes a person feel as though the whole city can see their disgrace. She had entered that house with poverty. She was leaving it with poverty, pregnancy, and the kind of betrayal that changes how a person understands love forever. Still she walked. That was the first lesson survival taught her. Even when dignity is wounded, movement is life. She took 2 buses before dawn, using the last of the money she had hidden in the hem of an old wrapper. By sunrise, she arrived in Surulere, at the small, overcrowded room of her mother's older cousin, Auntie Bisi Nwosu. When the older woman opened the door and saw her standing there soaked in tears, she was trying not to shed, one hand already resting unconsciously over her stomach. She did not ask for the full story first. She simply said, "Come inside." Sometimes the first miracle is not money. Sometimes it is being received without judgment. Later, when Ifeoma finally told her everything, the secret love, the pregnancy, the silence, the expulsion, Auntie Bisi sat in furious quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Listen to me carefully. What happened to you is wickedness, not shame. Do you hear me? Their wealth does not make them right." Ifeoma broke then, truly broke, weeping with the deep exhaustion of someone who had been holding herself together by force. But grief could not last forever. Poor women rarely receive that luxury. By the following week, reality had already begun pressing in. Rent, food, clinic visits, vomiting in the mornings, endless fatigue, fear of what people would say, fear of whether she could carry the pregnancy safely, fear of whether the child or children would one day ask questions she did not yet know how to answer. And beneath it all, a harder fear. Would this pain bury the dream she had once protected so fiercely? More than once she stared at her nursing notes and felt bitterness rise in her throat. What was the use of dreaming about hospital corridors and white uniforms when life had pushed her back into bare survival? What was the use of hope when hope had been the road that led her to heartbreak? But each time that darkness came, something deeper resisted. Not pride this time, purpose. Because inside her body was innocent life, and innocence creates responsibility. She could collapse later, she could mourn later, But now she had to endure. So she made herself a promise. She would not chase Kene Afolayan. She would not stand at the gates begging for recognition. She would not offer her child to people who had already called that child a trap. If love had failed her, then work would have to carry her. The months that followed were brutal. Auntie Bisi helped where she could, selling extra goods in the market, and stretching every naira until it nearly tore. Ifeoma took small sewing jobs from neighbors, washed clothes when her body allowed it, and studied at night whenever exhaustion did not swallow her whole. There were days she felt heroic. There were more days she felt afraid. That is the truth many stories hide. Resilience is not a constant emotion. It is a decision made again and again, often while crying, often while tired, often with no applause. Then came the scan. The nurse at the public clinic frowned at the screen, adjusted the machine, and frowned again. Ifeoma's heart thudded painfully. "Is something wrong?" The nurse looked up, startled into a smile. "Wrong? No, but you need to sit properly. You're carrying more than one baby." Ifeoma stared at her. The nurse gave a small laugh. "My dear, you're having triplets." For a second, the room disappeared. 3. Not one life to protect, but 3. 3 mouths, 3 school fees, 3 futures, 3 reasons not to fail. Terror rose first, then wonder, then a trembling kind of surrender. As she stepped out of the clinic into the hot Surulere afternoon, one hand resting over her stomach, Ifeoma understood that life had become harder than she had imagined, but also holier. The world that rejected her had not ended her story. It had only forced her to discover what was hidden inside her. And what was hidden inside her was not weakness. It was capacity. The kind women do not discover until life leaves them no softer option. That evening, she opened her old notebook again. On a fresh page, beneath faded nursing terms and old prayers, she wrote a new sentence with steady hands. "I will build a life that does not need their mercy." Outside, Lagos roared on. Inside that tiny room in Surulere, a mother was being born alongside her children. Pregnancy with one child is hard enough. Pregnancy with triplets while poor, abandoned, and heartbroken felt almost impossible. In Surulere, Ifeoma Nwosu's world shrank to survival. Mornings brought nausea, afternoons brought dizziness, nights brought fear. Food had to be stretched. Clinic visits had to be negotiated. Rent hung over every month like a threat. Yet the cruelest burden was not physical, it was emotional. She had to carry life while grieving the death of the future she once believed in. Still, Auntie Bisi refused to let her drown in self-pity. "You will cry," the older woman said one evening while sorting tomatoes into bowls for market. "But after crying, you will stand. Children do not eat tears." That sentence stayed with Ifeoma. So she stood. As her body changed, so did her mind. The softness that once made room for secret love began hardening into maternal discipline. She learned how to save coins in hidden envelopes. She learned which clinic staff would explain things kindly and which would dismiss poor women too quickly. She learned how to smile at neighbors without inviting their gossip. She learned to protect her peace because peace, too, was a resource. And most importantly, she made one decision that shaped the rest of her life. She would never raise her children on bitterness. She would not fill their ears with the poison of revenge. She would not make them feel unwanted because they were born from betrayal. If the world had welcomed them badly, then she would become the welcome they did not receive. Months passed. Her belly grew heavy, then enormous. Moving became painful. Sleeping became difficult. Some night, she lay awake in Auntie Bisi's cramped room, one hand on her stomach, speaking softly to the lives inside her. "I don't know everything yet," she whispered once. "But I am here. I am trying, and I will not leave you." The labor came early and violently. By the time they rushed her to the hospital, dawn had barely broken. The pain was blinding, wave after wave, tearing through her body with a force that made language useless. Hours later, drenched in sweat and trembling with exhaustion, Ifeoma heard the first cry, then the second, then the third. 3 voices, 3 proofs that her suffering had not been empty. When the nurse placed them near her one after another, she stared through tears at their tiny faces in disbelief. Jason, Janelle, Jesse. So small, so fragile, so innocent. In that moment, the story of her life changed. She was no longer just a betrayed girl with a broken dream. She was a mother of 3 lives, and motherhood rearranged everything. Her pain was still real, but it was no longer the center. Purpose had taken its place. The months that followed were brutal in new ways. Feeding, crying, sickness, exhaustion, no sleep, no money. Some days she could barely remember her own name. But every hardship taught her something education alone could not. Patience, endurance, sacrifice, and the quiet intelligence of women who build futures from scraps. And slowly another truth returned. Her dream was not dead. It had only been delayed. One afternoon, while rocking Jessie with one foot and helping Jason stop crying, Ifeoma saw her old nursing notebook beneath a folded wrapper. For a long moment she stared at it. Then she reached for it. Not because life had become easier, but because she finally understood something powerful. Her children did not need a defeated mother. They needed a rising one. So that night, in the heat of a cramped Surulere room, while 3 babies slept in patched blankets, Ifeoma Nwosu began studying again. Not as the naive girl who once hoped love would open doors, but as a woman who now knew that sometimes God allows pain to strip away illusion, so purpose can stand alone. The years that followed did not transform Ifeoma Nwosu's life overnight. There was no miracle contract, no sudden benefactor, no dramatic rescue that lifted her from struggle into ease. What came instead was slower, harder, and in many ways more powerful. Discipline. In the tiny Surulere room she shared with Auntie Bisi and the triplets, Ifeoma built a life one stubborn decision at a time. She woke before dawn to boil water, wash tiny clothes, and prepare pap before the children stirred. She learned how to balance 3 babies on one exhausted body and still keep moving. When they were sick, she stayed awake all night and still found the strength to stand in line at public clinics the next morning. When money disappeared too quickly, she found small jobs, mending clothes, helping a neighbor count stock, tutoring a younger girl in English for a few extra naira. And every night, no matter how tired she was, she studied. Sometimes only for 20 minutes before sleep overcame her. Sometimes with Jessie on her lap and Janelle pulling at her wrapper. Sometimes while Jason slept with one tiny fist curled against her arm. She studied because she had stopped seeing education as a dream. It was now survival with direction. There were days she nearly gave up. Once, after being turned away from a training opportunity because she could not afford the final registration fee, she walked home under the hot Lagos sun with tears burning behind her eyes. She entered the room quietly, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the wall while the children played on the floor with bottle tops and a broken plastic spoon. Auntie Bisi, sorting peppers in a tray nearby, looked up and said, "What happened?" "I'm tired," Ifeoma replied, her voice flat. "Every time I try to move forward, something drags me back." Auntie Bisi nodded slowly as though she had known that feeling her whole life, then moved forward, tired. Ifeoma looked at her. The older woman shrugged. "Who told you strength means you won't feel weak? Strength means weak will not stop you." It was not a soft speech. It was not poetic comfort. It was the kind of truth poor women pass to one another like inheritance. So Ifeoma kept going. Years sharpened the triplets into distinct little people. Jason became watchful, serious, protective. Even as a boy, he noticed more than he said. If Janelle and Jesse argued, he stepped between them. If their mother came home worn out, he looked at her face carefully before asking for anything. Janelle became bright, quick-tongued, curious. She questioned everything. Why the sky changed color, why rich children on television spoke differently, why their mother sometimes grew quiet when other children talked about their fathers. Jesse remained the softest of the three, affectionate and easily moved. He was the first to hug Ifeoma when she looked tired, and the first to cry when one of the others was sick, the first to laugh loudly enough to break tension in the room. Together, they became the center of her life and her greatest education. They also became her mirror. Through them, Ifeoma began to see that children do not only need food and school fees, they need emotional climate. They need to grow in an atmosphere that does not teach them to hate themselves. So she became careful with her words. She never called them burdens, never made them feel accidental, never let her private grief become their identity. When they asked about their father while still very young, she would say only, "There are some stories I will tell you when the time is right." Not because she wanted to deceive them forever, but because truth, poorly timed, can wound as much as lies. Eventually, her consistency bore fruit. A church women's group helped pay part of a preparatory fee. A retired nurse in the neighborhood lent her old textbooks. A local pharmacist allowed her to help in the shop some weekends in exchange for small pay and access to basic medical knowledge. Step by step, door by narrow door, Ifeoma pushed her way back toward the dream she had nearly buried. When she finally gained admission to nursing training, she did not scream or dance. She simply sat down and cried quietly, one hand over her mouth, because some victories arrive carrying the memory of every humiliation that tried to prevent them. By then, the children were old enough to understand one thing clearly. Their mother was fighting for them. And children who witness sacrifice often become wiser than their age. On the morning Ifeoma resumed training, Jason held her hand at the bus stop and said with the solemn seriousness that always made him seem older, "Mummy, when you become a nurse, will people stop looking down on you?" The question pierced her. She knelt slightly so she could look him in the eyes. "Some people will still look down on others because that is the kind of heart they have," she said gently. "But education helps you stand straighter when they do." It was the kind of lesson poverty teaches well, not that status gives worth, but that knowledge gives voice. As the Danfo carried her toward a future she had rebuilt for pain, Ifeoma looked out at Lagos rushing past, crowded, loud, unequal, relentless, and understood something she had not known at 19. Being broken does not end a life. Sometimes it teaches a person how to build one with stronger hands. By the time Ifeoma Nwosu completed her nursing training, she was no longer the frightened 19-year-old girl who had once been thrown out of a mansion under the cover of shame. Life had done what pain often does when it does not destroy a person. It had refined her. She had learned to make decisions without panic, to speak without apologizing for existing, to enter a room with quiet purpose instead of borrowed permission. When she got her placement at St. Catherine's Specialist Hospital, Ikoyi, it felt less like luck and more like the visible reward of invisible years. Years of studying under weak bulbs, years of carrying babies on tired hips while memorizing medical terms, years of choosing discipline over despair. Her first day in the hospital uniform was a private victory. She stood before the small mirror in her modest Lekki Phase 1 apartment. An apartment not luxurious, but clean, calm, and fully hers in spirit, and adjusted her name tag with trembling fingers. Nurse Ifeoma Nwosu. For a moment, emotion rose so suddenly she had to close her eyes. Not because the uniform erased the past, not because success made suffering fair, but because she had become living proof that humiliation is not destiny. Behind her, the triplets, now older, sharper, full of personality, watched with excitement. Janelle clapped first. "Mummy, you look like the nurses on TV, but finer." Jessie hugged her waist immediately. "You'll help sick people and still come back home, Abby?" Jason, as usual, said less. But his eyes held the serious pride of a child who had been watching her rise for years. "You said you would do it," he told her simply. Ifeoma smiled, but her throat tightened. "Yes," she said softly. "I did." That morning, as she stepped out into Lagos with her bag on one shoulder, and responsibility settled deep in her chest, she understood something important. Success does not always look like wealth. Sometimes it looks like becoming the answer to the prayers you once whispered while crying. At St. Catherine's, Ifeoma quickly earned respect. She was not the loudest nurse, nor the one most eager to impress doctors, but she was steady, observant, calm under pressure. Patients trusted her because she spoke with warmth, not performance. Families listened because she explained things with patience. Senior staff noticed that she worked not just with skill, but with compassion sharpened by experience. Suffering had educated her in ways textbooks never could. She knew what it meant to be dismissed because of appearance. She knew what it meant to fear medical bills. She knew what it meant to sit beside uncertainty with no rich surname to soften the blow. So she treated people carefully, not as files, not as burdens, not as interruptions, but as human beings who were often one bad day away from collapse. At home, life was still not easy, but it had gained structure. The apartment in Lekki Phase 1 was modest. 2 rooms, reliable but aging furniture. School shoes lined near the wall, books stacked neatly in corners, a dining table that had seen better years. Yet the place carried something the Afolayan mansion never had. Peace. It held school routines, bedtime prayers, laughter over burnt toast, arguments about homework, mended uniforms, shared chores, and the kind of warmth that grows when love is chosen daily rather than performed publicly. Jason had become deeply protective of the family, often trying to act older than he was. Janelle had developed a lively intelligence that made her both charming and difficult to outtalk. Jessie remained tender-hearted, quick to notice pain in others. And Ifeoma, though still guarded in matters of love, had become the emotional center of their world. She did not talk much about the past. She did not speak Ken's name. She did not spend nights wondering whether he had suffered. That part of her life had been placed in a locked room inside her mind, not healed, not forgotten, but disciplined. Still, some wounds do not disappear. They simply become quieter. There were moments when memory returned without warning. A certain kind of rain against the window. A man's expensive cologne in a hospital corridor. The sight of a luxury car pausing too long at a traffic light. In those moments, the old ache stirred briefly. Not because she still belonged to the past, but because betrayal leaves an imprint even after survival has moved on. Yet Ifeoma had learned an educational truth that now shaped how she raised her children and lived her life. Pain is a teacher, but it must not become a ruler. She taught the children that dignity matters more than display, that wealth without kindness is poverty in disguise, that education gives a person options, but character determines what they do with them. That silence in the face of injustice can wound as deeply as violence. Without naming her own story, she was already turning it into wisdom for the next generation. What Ifeoma did not know was that while she had been rebuilding life with extraordinary discipline, the man who once failed her had been building the opposite kind of success. In Victoria Island, behind glass walls and polished boardrooms, Kene Afolayan had become exactly what his family wanted: powerful, admired, impeccably dressed, and publicly accomplished. But not whole. And far away in a world of luxury, where legacy was mistaken for meaning, his carefully managed life was beginning to crack. Because while Ifeoma had spent years becoming stronger, Kene had spent years becoming emptier. And very soon, fate would force both of them into the same room again. If Ifeoma Nwosu's life had been forged in hardship, Kene Afolayan's had been polished into brilliance, so bright it almost hid the emptiness beneath it. By 35, he had become the kind of man business magazines admired. As managing director of Afolayan Energy Holdings in Victoria Island, he moved through glass-walled offices, board meetings, investor dinners, and strategy briefings with the calm precision of someone trained from birth to carry power well. His suits were perfect. His speech was measured. His image was immaculate. To the world, he was success. To himself, he was often a man living inside a life he had not truly chosen. He had money, influence, and respect, but peace remained strangely absent. Every achievement seemed to arrive carrying an invisible hollowness. New deals brought applause, but not joy. Family approval brought access, but not freedom. Even the penthouse views and luxury cars felt less like rewards and more like expensive decorations around a deeply unfinished life. And at the center of that unfinished life was a silence he could never outrun. He still remembered that night in the downstairs hall as if it had happened yesterday. Ifeoma, standing pale and shaken, his mother's voice slicing through the house, the servants pretending not to stare, and himself saying nothing. That memory had become his private courtroom. No matter how much success surrounded him, it returned. At odd hours. In the middle of meetings, in the quiet, just before sleep, in the rain. He had tried in the first weeks after she was thrown out to ask discreet questions. He called one of the drivers aside. He pressed the old steward for information. Once he even drove through Surulere, looking for her with only fragments of an address in his head. But he had not searched like a man willing to lose everything. He had searched like a guilty son trying not to make the scandal larger. There was a difference, and deep down, Kene knew it. His parents made sure the life moved on quickly. They buried the incident in silence and redirected him toward the future they preferred. Meetings were arranged, international travel increased, public appearances multiplied. By the time months passed, then years, it became easier for everyone around him to behave as though Ifeoma had simply vanished into the lower-class haze from which he came. But Kene did not forget. He only became more skilled at functioning while haunted. That haunting followed him into his relationship with Vanessa Cole. On paper, Vanessa was perfect. Educated abroad, stylish, politically useful. Daughter of a powerful family, she knew how to sit beside powerful men without ever appearing intimidated by them. She knew the right charities to support, the right smiles to give photographers, the right tone to use with older women who measured worth by poise and pedigree. She was everything Mrs. Kene Afolayan believed a future wife should be, but what looked elegant from outside felt dead from within. Vanessa did not love Ken in the deep, sacrificial way real love demands. She admired his position. She appreciated his name. She understood the value of what a marriage to him would secure. But affection between them had become a performance, civil, polished, useful, and emotionally empty. Conversations between them often felt like negotiations, wearing fashionable clothes. One evening, at a high-end restaurant in Victoria Island, Vanessa scrolled through her phone while discussing seating arrangements for an upcoming charity gala, as if they were already married. "My father thinks the minister's wife should be near your mother," she said, barely looking up. "And I think the press should get only the approved angle if the engagement announcement happens that night." Kane stared at her. "Do you ever hear yourself?" She looked up then, mildly amused. "Do you ever stop being dramatic?" "This is our relationship to you?" he asked. "An announcement angle?" Vanessa set her glass down with controlled elegance. "Please don't start. You know how these things work." There it was again, that phrase. These things. As if human lives were systems of placement. As if intimacy were logistics. As if marriage were merely brand alignment with flowers. Kane leaned back, exhausted in a way sleep could not solve. "Maybe that's the problem. I do know how these things work." Vanessa's eyes narrowed slightly. "Then act like it." That sentence followed him home, because that was exactly what he had been doing for years, acting like it. Acting like duty was enough. Acting like regret could be buried beneath performance. Acting like success could silence conscience. Acting like a man can betray love and still become whole by pretending hard enough. At Banana Island, his mother remained what she had always been, elegant, strategic, emotionally invasive beneath her polished restraint. She monitored timelines, spoke often of legacy, and had recently begun pressing harder about marriage and heirs. "We cannot postpone structure forever," she told him one afternoon in her private lounge. "A family like ours must think beyond emotion." Kane gave a cold laugh. "That has always been your favorite religion." Mrs. Afolayan's expression barely shifted. "And yet it is the religion that built everything you now enjoy." He looked at her for a long time, wondering whether she had ever once considered what her values had cost him, or whether she counted all sacrifice worthwhile so long as the family name stayed intact. Chief Afolayan, as usual, framed things in the language of continuity and influence. Expansion, alliances, future stability. His version of fatherhood was managerial, firm, strategic, emotionally economical. In that house, nobody asked if Kene was happy, only whether he was aligned. And perhaps that was why his inner life had begun cracking in deeper ways. He was no longer merely tired. He was splitting under the strain of long-term self-betrayal. Every expensive room felt more airless. Every public smile took more effort. Every conversation about marriage, succession, and image made something inside him recoil. He had become a man applauded by society and unknown to himself. The irony was brutal. While Ifeoma had been thrown into suffering and forced to discover her strength, Ken had been cushioned by privilege and slowly hollowed out by it. Then came the first visible fracture. At a private event hosted by the Coles, Ken arrived late after a board meeting and found Vanessa laughing too intimately with a foreign investor whose hand lingered at her waist longer than decorum required. It was not merely flirtation, it was possession, made careless by assumption. And when Vanessa noticed Ken watching, she did not look ashamed. She looked irritated. Later, in the car park, he confronted her quietly. "What exactly is this?" Vanessa folded her arms. "Don't embarrass yourself. I'm asking you a question." "And I'm answering you," she said coolly. "Don't behave as though this relationship was ever built on some sacred emotional fantasy. We both know why we are here." Ken felt something go cold inside him. "So that's it? Strategy?" Vanessa's laugh was elegant and cruel. "Please, if you wanted love, you should have married for it years ago." The words hit with surgical precision because they found the wound he had spent years hiding. For a moment he could not speak. Vanessa adjusted her clutch and stepped closer, lowering her voice. Whatever guilt you still carry about whatever village girl mistake happened in your past, deal with it privately. But don't stand here expecting me to apologize for understanding how the real world works. Village girl mistake. The phrase struck like a slap, not only because it was vicious, but because it sounded like the very language his family had used to erase the only real thing he had ever felt. Kane looked at Vanessa and saw with terrible clarity the life he had allowed himself to drift into, one made of surfaces, transactions, and emotional cowardice stretched across years. That night, he drove home with something dark and restless building inside him. For the first time in a long time, it was no longer grief alone. It was collapse. Because a man can survive guilt for years, but eventually there comes a moment when all the compromises he has called maturity begin to look like ruin. And somewhere across Lagos, in the peace of a modest home he had never earned the right to enter again, lived the woman whose memory still made every false life around him feel unbearably loud. King drove out of Victoria Island with Vanessa's words still burning in his chest. If you wanted love, you should have married for it years ago. Rain had started lightly over Lagos, turning headlights into blurred streaks across the road. The city looked beautiful in the way wounded things sometimes do from a distance. But inside Kene Afolayan, there was no beauty left, only noise. At the foot of the Lekki Ikoyi link bridge, his phone rang again. His mother. He ignored it. It rang once more. Then a message entered, sharp and cold even on a screen. You will not disgrace this family because of emotional weakness. Be at home tonight. We need to finalize the gala announcement. He laughed once bitterly. Emotional weakness. That was what they had always called anything human. He drove faster. The rain thickened. Wipers beat urgently across the windshield. Neon lights from passing cars smeared into restless color. Every voice in his life seemed to be shouting at once. His mother's control, his father's legacy talk, Vanessa's contempt, and beneath them all, the oldest voice of all. Ifeoma standing in that hall, looking at him, waiting for truth. He gripped the steering wheel tighter. For years he had lived as if silence were maturity, as if obedience were wisdom, as if losing the woman he loved was the price of belonging to power. But now the lie would no longer hold. He did not belong to power. He belonged to regret. Another flash of memory hit him. Rain in the laundry room, her voice in the dark compound. The way she once said, "People like me don't survive being loved by men like you." She had been right. Not because love was impossible, because he had been too weak to protect it. The rain came down harder. A truck changed lanes ahead too suddenly. Keene swerved instinctively, tires skidding across the slick road. The SUV lurched. Metal screamed, glass shattered. For one sickening second, the world spun into light, impact, and violent silence. Then darkness. When consciousness returned, it did not come gently. There were beeping machines, a burning ache through his body, the sterile smell of medicine, heavy bandages, a dim ceiling he did not recognize. Hospital. His throat was dry. His limbs felt dragged through pain. He tried to move and failed. A doctor's voice came first, calm and controlled. "Mr. Afolayan, you're awake. You were brought in after a major accident. You're safe, but you need to remain still. Safe." The word felt strange. Nothing in him felt safe. Hours later, after scans, consultations, and his parents' arrival, the fuller truth came. He would live. But some of the internal damage was severe. The specialist spoke carefully, as doctors do when facts carry emotional ruin. "There is a strong possibility," he said, "that your injuries may affect your ability to father children naturally." For a long moment, Kene said nothing. His mother gasped softly. His father went still. The room changed. Because in a family like the Afolayans, that news was not merely medical. It was dynastic. But Kene barely heard them. Children. The word opened something raw and terrible inside him. Somewhere in Lagos, perhaps lost forever to him, lived the life he had once failed before it even began. And now, just as fate stripped him of the future his family valued most, the past he had buried rose before him like judgment. For the first time in years, Ken did not feel powerful, rich, or protected. He felt exposed, broken, punished. And fate, having shattered his carefully arranged world, was only just beginning. Because in the very hospital where he now lay between pain and consequence, a woman in a nurse's uniform was about to walk into his room and change everything.